This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. I'm Sophie Ikenye. Our top stories. 2 weeks to form a civilian government, the African Union threatens Sudan with suspension if the military continues to be in charge.
There are a lot of armed vehicles belonging to the military, and we still don't know why they are there.
The Egyptian parliament votes to extend presidential terms, a move which could see President al-Sisi rule till 2030. Fears that social media use can worsen the risk of epileptic seizures in some, but how much is known about the condition on the continent? Also in the program, taking back African culture. The South African rapper Sho Majozi tells us why her heritage is key to her music.
I'm always trying to bring my culture with me all the time, but I suppose it really resonates with a lot of people.
And in sports, can Cameroon's 23-year-old goalkeeper help Ajax overcome Juventus in the Champions League? Thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. In the past hour, the U.S. State Department has announced that the country may consider removing Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list should there be significant changes in its government. Now, the African Union earlier warned that it will suspend Sudan if the military council does not hand over power to a civilian government within 2 weeks. Well, the BBC's Catherine Biaruhanga reports from Nairobi.
Keeping vigil over their hard-won victories. They might have toppled 2 generals, but these protesters say the revolution will not be complete until the regime that kept former President Omar al-Bashir in power is completely dismantled. There's a more immediate worry too, that security forces could use violence to break up demonstrations.
Until now, there are a lot of armed vehicles belonging to the military, and we still don't know why they are there.
We want a transition government and a military council that will bring justice for the dead.
There were signs the military was opening up the media space. Members of the opposition Sudanese Professionals Association were hosted on state television. There was also coverage of the release of activists. And today, the director of state television and radio was fired. Nevertheless, Sudan's military council rulers are on an international charm offensive. Here, their leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, is meeting with a Chinese delegation. And perhaps surprisingly, the council's deputy leader has met with Western diplomats from the United Kingdom, the European Union and the Netherlands. International support will help cement the army's legitimacy, but also hopefully bring with it much-needed support for Sudan's crumbling economy. Both sides appear to be at a standstill, but also digging in to make sure their vision of a future Sudan is realized. Catherine Biaruhanga, BBC News, Nairobi.
Well, the African Union has in the past been swift to suspend countries that undergo military coups. So what could be the reason for a 2-week ultimatum for the military leadership in Sudan? It's a question I put to Dr. Hisham A. Helia from the Royal United Services Institute.
Egypt chairs the African Union at present, and I think Cairo is particularly concerned about stability as it sees it in Sudan, being its southern neighbor, and is actually quite supportive of the new military regime in Khartoum at present.
All right, so if within those 15 days or by that time, Sudan hasn't changed, nothing has changed, what would suspension, how would suspension impact on the country?
There's obviously no enforcement mechanism that the African Union can really put into place. Any repercussions would happen as the result of bilateral relations between different members of the African Union and the new regime in Khartoum. So I think the main impact of a suspension would be to sort of, let's say, sully the reputation to some extent of the new military-led regime in Khartoum internationally. But I frankly don't know what sort of effect that might have on its own, at least, in terms of adjusting behavior in Khartoum.
I wonder, though, whether this puts even more pressure on the military. They are already kind of nervous, even within. Will they not panic?
I don't think that they'll panic, quite frankly. I think that their concern has to do more with how regional countries relate to them, but much closer than the African Union, okay, in terms of direct capitals. And I think they're more concerned about how the protesters on the street will react to movements by the military regime.
How do you think Sudan should go about this transition?
Any country that's coming out of a period of autocracy or dictatorship should try very quickly to minimize the role of a military establishment and turn over to accountability, rule of law, and a better social contract between citizens and the rulers. And I think that applies very much in Sudan. But I would humbly suggest that we really listen to people on the ground in Sudan and see what they really want, as opposed to what outsiders necessarily desire. And all that we can see coming from the ground in Sudan is that indeed they want a civilian-led transition with cooperation, obviously, from the military and other parts of the Sudanese state.
Well, let's take a quick look now at other stories making headlines across Africa and the rest of the world. Calls for resignation from pro-democracy demonstrators in Algeria have cost another high-ranking official his role. Tayeb Belaiz, the head of Algeria's Constitutional Council, has stepped down from his position following mass rallies that have engulfed the country. Now, this comes after protesters earlier this month succeeded in forcing the country's long-serving president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, from power. At least 174 people have been killed since the fighting on the outskirts of the Libyan capital Tripoli started. And the World Health Organization says most of the dead have been fighters, but at least 14 civilians have also died. Prosecutors in Paris say the blaze that devastated the city's iconic Notre Dame Cathedral overnight was an accident, not arson. And the main structure of the cathedral is basically intact. Many world leaders, including Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo, have expressed sympathy with France and the French people. Now, Egypt's parliament has approved a constitutional change that would lengthen President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's term in office, making it possible for him to stay in power until 2030. Now, Mr. al-Sisi's supporters say he needs more time in office to complete economic reforms. Well, the former army general swept to power in a military coup in 2013 following the overthrow of Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. Now, he served as a military ruler until April last year, when he was democratically elected in a landslide. Now, the 64-year-old leader is heavily supported by Egypt's military. Well, the BBC's Sally Nabil has been following developments for us in Cairo. Sally, what specifically have the MPs voted for?
It's a set of amendments which is being voted on now in Parliament, the most important of which is this article that would extend President Sisi's rule for more than a decade. The amendment extended his second term in office from 4 to 6 years, and it exceptionally allows him to run for a third term, which is another 6 years. in the original constitution, the president should run for 2 terms only. Each term should be 4 years. But now, after the amendments, any new president would run for 2 terms. Each term is 6 years, with an exception for President Sisi only, to give him the chance to run for a 3rd term. In addition to that, there is an important article regarding the army's role, which has been appointed as the guardian of the constitution and the civil state. Also, there is a quota allocated for female MPs. They will be given 25% of the parliament seats. And also there would be a new chamber introduced, an upper house to the parliament, in addition to better representation for Copts and for Egyptians living abroad, and also for the disabled. So it's a package of new amendments, but of course the highlight of which is these articles related to President Sisi's term.
All right, so it of course will be put to a referendum, but earlier the opposition in Egypt had raised concerns about the bill. What's been their reaction?
Absolutely, opposition forces have been quite angry regarding these amendments. They say that this brings the country back to square one, to the Egyptian revolution era. It destroys rotation of power. It concentrates all the authorities in the hands of one man, who is the current president, because he would also have or enjoy tight control over the judiciary. So opposition forces are very unhappy about that, and they say it's an abortion of all the benefits that have been gained after the 2011 revolution. But they also complain that they have no room to express themselves, as the government currently controls all the mainstream local media, so they have no chance to speak.
All right, Sally Nabil in Cairo for us. Thank you. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Still to come, find out which players at the ongoing Under-17 Africa Cup of Nations has caught the eye of ex-Senegal international El Hadj Diouf. Peter has all the details. I'm Sophie Ikenye, and you're watching Focus on Africa from BBC World News. The top stories on this program: the US has announced that the country may consider removing Sudan from state sponsor of terrorism list if there are significant government changes. Earlier, the African Union had warned Sudan it risks suspension if there's no transfer of power to a civilian government within 2 weeks. Now, Egypt's parliament has approved a constitutional change that would lengthen President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's term in office, making it possible for him to stay in power until 2030. Mr. Sisi's supporters say he needs more time in office to complete economic reforms. Now, you may have seen warnings when you're watching television about upcoming flashing images. That's because it can help prevent those with a photosensitive epilepsy from having a seizure. But you almost never see this for online videos, and there are fears that this puts sufferers at a higher risk of having a fit triggered by flashing lights or contrasting fast-moving images. Now, around 50 million people in the world have epilepsy, which is a major disorder triggered by abnormal electrical activity in the brain. An estimated 10 million people in Africa live with the condition, some 200,000 of who have a photosensitive epilepsy. Now, 80% of epilepsy cases in Africa are not treated with readily available and affordable drugs. But now, campaigners are urging social media companies to do more to protect them from harmful pictures. Graham Sachel reports.
Sophie's seizures are triggered by flashing lights. She has photosensitive epilepsy.
When I'm scrolling through Facebook and Instagram, I don't know what's coming next. Sometimes there are posts that I know will trigger my seizures, and I have no control over when they appear.
Sophie has complained to both Facebook and Instagram about the lack of warnings on posts.
Their response has been, you can unfollow that page or you can unlike that page, but it's a problem when it sort of is a suggested ad for you or suggested post. I don't know how they come up with those sorts of things. How am I meant to control what they show me?
Social media is not regulated, and there's a growing worry about more sinister posts which deliberately target people with epilepsy.
What some people are doing is creating content designed to attract people with epilepsy, and deliberately concealed in the content are images designed to provoke a seizure. We think that sort of hateful and cruel behaviour is actually an assault.
In a statement, Facebook, which also owns Instagram, told us, "We have strict policies in place to help people who encounter abusive behaviour. We are always exploring ways to make our platform safer, and we're grateful to the Epilepsy Society for bringing this issue into focus." But for Sophie, that's not enough.
I don't think they're taking enough responsibility. There is a syndrome called SUDEP, which is sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, which you can have a seizure and you can die from it. So it is really important that people do control their seizures.
Sophie, for one, is clear. More needs to be done to stop people having seizures. Graham Satchell, BBC News.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, 80% of epilepsy cases in Africa are not treated with readily available and affordable drugs. So let's speak to Professor Leigh Sander, who's a neurologist and the medical director of the Epilepsy Society in the UK. Thanks for taking time to talk to us on the program. You've worked extensively in Africa. I wonder why so many people don't get the treatment that they require.
I think that it's very important for people to understand how epilepsy is seen in many parts of the world, because it comes and goes. It's not seen as a disease, but something often is spiritual. So people do not identify this as a medical problem. They will go and seek traditional health healers to get treatment. Often you don't have trained people that will diagnose. You don't have the infrastructure to actually diagnose the condition and to get the medicine that people need.
And so it's not about access to medicine, it's about who, the people who suffer from it, who they approach for treatment.
It's about understanding. People need to be aware that there could be a problem. So if people are not aware of a medical problem, they're not going to seek help. That's the first issue. The second is you need to have people that are trained, understand, that can realize a diagnosis, and then the next part would be the treatment.
All right. So let's talk about triggers and what could we've seen that video just a little earlier about flashing images on television and social media. What are other triggers that family and friends and community really should be aware of?
I think that most cases of epilepsy, they are not people are not born with them. They are caused by some scar in the brain, often as a result of head injuries, brain infection. For instance, malaria. If someone survives cerebral malaria, they can develop epilepsy later. For some people, sometimes you may have a trigger, and this might be different for different individuals. For instance, photosensitive epilepsy, it's something that affects people that have a specific type of epilepsy during part of their life. And during this time, they might not know they have photosensitive epilepsy. And if they're exposed to some, like a trigger from social media, they can have a seizure.
All right. What other triggers are there? Because I understand they're different, West Africa,
Yes.
Southern Africa.
Yeah, no, the triggers are very much the same everywhere in the world. Sleep deprivation, people not sleeping correctly, not having a good night of sleep, people having an infection, people, for instance, if they get very stress or a lot of anxiety, they can trigger seizures for some people.
All right. Professor Leigh Sander, thank you for taking time to talk to us on Focus on Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. Let's find out what's happening in the world of sport. Peter.
Many thanks, Sophie. The Confederation of African Football has stopped 6 players from taking part in the Under-17 Africa Cup of Nations in Tanzania. That's after they failed MRI tests, which determined their age and eligibility to take part. Cameroon are the most affected team, with 3 players failing the test, while host Tanzania have 2 and Guinea 1. Now, the Under-17 Nations Cup kicked off on Sunday in Dar es Salaam with Nigeria's Golden Eaglets beating Tanzania's Serengeti Boys 5-4 in the opener. Well, ex-Senegal international El Hadj Diouf watched that game and told the BBC he's impressed by some of the talent on display.
If you watch this game, I got two boys on my mind, the number 10 of Tanzania, very good players, and I hope they're going to look after him. And if I'm Amunike, I'm going to take him for the African Nation Cup because this boy need to learn quick. Because if you see the talent he got, he can learn quick and to be tomorrow the star of Africa. And the number 13 of Nigeria, very good players, good technical ability.
And those two players that El Hadj Diouf was talking about are the Nigeria number 13, Akinwumi Amour, and Tanzania's number 10, Kevin Pius-John. So we'll definitely keep a lookout for those two in the future. Let's talk Champions League now, and two much anticipated games kick off in just over an hour. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer has told his Manchester United side that they can't rely on fate to get through against Barcelona in the Champions League tonight. They head to the camp now, trading their quarter-final 1-0 from the first leg. A hugely impressive Ajax head to Juventus in tonight's other game, which is poised at 1-1. 2 years ago, the Dutch side were runners-up in the Europa League. So does their Cameroon goalkeeper Andre Onana believe this side is stronger than it was 2 years ago?
I think we are more stronger than the last team now 2 years ago. So we are showing game by game that what we are in the quarterfinal in Champions League is not something easier. So everyone can see what we are doing.
Is everybody in Cameroon crazy about this match?
Not only in Cameroon, I think everywhere in the world.
Thanks.
Good luck to them. That's your sports.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Now, the South African musician Sho Madjozi is known for breaking boundaries with both her music and style. Now, since she burst onto the music scene, rapping in her home language, Xitsonga, and she's been praised for championing the heritage of a people who have often been marginalized. She's been speaking to BBC Africa's What's New program. And just to warn you, there are some flashing images in this report.
I was just watching your different performances on Global Citizen, across the board. Like, you really, really give your culture a vibe.
Thank you.
You make your culture look cool.
Yeah.
Is she rocking that skirt? What?
I know.
You know?
South Africa, I think we're still a little bit behind in terms of embracing ourselves and our Africanness. But when I brought Shibelani, and I wear Shibelani in all my performances, but when I brought that on and I kind of, I wear a shorter one than the traditional one, and the colors I use are always different, and I'm always trying to innovate it, but I'm always trying to bring my culture with me. All the time, but I suppose it really resonates with a lot of people, the idea that, like, let's take back our cultures, but also not make it an impractical way,
exactly.
How our grandmothers wore it like 100 years ago. Like, how does it feel, how does it look to be a young African today? I was in South Africa till I was about 16, but even there, though, I lived in different parts, and I was raised primarily in Limpopo province, but then after that, obviously, moved to Tanzania, studied in the US, lived in Senegal for some time, and then moved back.
And let's talk about huku. Like your fashion, your style, the music itself. It's so funny to have a South African who speaks Swahili.
Yeah.
And of course, I know you have an explanation to that.
I started making music like 2 years ago, and the first 2 songs I did were in my mother tongue, Xitsonga. But, I thought it would be unfair to not also do something for the other place that raised me, which was East Africa. So I made that song, specifically to cater to, like, my other home, my second home. I want to do some new stuff, some unreleased stuff, and I want to get sort of Nairobi's opinion on some songs that I'm working on. Yeah. Like some Swahili gqom that I'm doing, so I really want to kind of test the
Swahili gqom? Swahili gqom?
Yes,
okay.
Of which I'm the pioneer, because huku was, of course, the first example of that. Yeah. Swahili gqom, and I think it's going to happen more and more. Of course, like, when you start something, hopefully it sets on fire.
Swahili. Oh, don't forget you can get in touch with me and some of the team on Twitter. I'm Artsy Kenya. That's all from the program from me and the rest of the Focus on Africa team. Thanks for your company.